When it comes to HGiG, there's a lot of wrong information out there. Wrong information like a game must support HGiG in order to use it. This is completely wrong because there's not a single game out there what supports HGiG. Hello my friends and welcome back to my channel Amok for All. Before we start, I have a big favor to ask. If you're new to my channel, please take a moment, subscribe to my channel. I would much appreciate it. Thank you very much. To understand why there's not a single game out there what supports HGiG, we need to understand what is HGiG in general. What is this option actually doing? And by the way, this explanation counts also for the Xbox Series. I'm just using the PlayStation 5 for explanation because it's already set up. Okay, so HGiG, this option is just available when we're talking about HDR10 material. So HGiG is not a HDR format. Okay, HGiG is a picture option in the HDR gaming menu on supported TVs like the LG CX. So as you can see under advanced controls, and when I'm going back, by the way, we are in the HDR gaming picture mode, and just in the HDR gaming picture mode you have the option HGiG, at least on the LG CX, but I'm quite sure this is just an option in the HDR gaming picture mode. Okay, so under dynamic tone mapping we have now the option between dynamic tone mapping on, off and HGiG. So again, HGiG is not a HDR format. HGiG is an option how to display HDR10 material on your TV. I try not to get into much details, but let me quickly explain the main difference between HGiG and DTM ON, dynamic tone mapping on. So dynamic tone mapping off, in my opinion, is in 99% of the cases a very bad option to play HDR games. Okay, so far just Forza Horizon 4 was very nice in dynamic tone mapping off, but in most of the games HGiG or dynamic tone mapping on is the better option. Okay, so anyway, we have right now a very nice bright object on the screen, and now when I'm changing between DTM on and HGiG, there's almost no difference. It's very minor that there's a little bit of a brightness change on the screen, but it's almost the same. Okay, so different story when we now look, let's say, in this direction where we have no bright object to display and we do exactly the same. You can see a very big difference in terms of the brightness, and I'm not talking about the peak brightness, because the peak brightness between dynamic tone mapping on and HGiG is more or less the same, maybe a little bit of a difference, a couple of candela, but it is the same. I'm talking about the let's call it base brightness in the background here, and this is a big difference, and this is what dynamic tone mapping is doing, because right now dynamic tone mapping is analyzing the screen, and it will find that there is no bright object where the TV has to focus on, and it can use the brightness from the TV to brighten up the whole picture. This is what many people like, because now you can actually see a lot more if you look very closely, and especially in very bright rooms, of course, this is a big advantage. As soon there's a bright object, of course, dynamic tone mapping can't do anything because it has to focus on this very bright objects. It can't actually brighten up the rest. So you can end up actually that you have with HGiG a brighter picture than with dynamic tone mapping on. In certain situations this can happen, but in most of the cases very bright objects are displayed exactly the same as with HGiG. As you can see here, there is really almost no difference, very minor. But again, when we look in this direction, perfect example on what is dynamic tone mapping doing. And by the way, the adjustment between changing this brightness here to this brightness here takes around 3 to 5 seconds. Okay, in the worst case it's 5 seconds. In the average time it takes around 5 seconds to adjust the screen, and I proved this already in a couple of videos what I have done back then. Maybe I do a follow-up video on this because it's really interesting to explain this actually. So it takes some time for the TV to realize that there is no bright objects to display, I can brighten up the picture. Okay, this is how should I say, a feature for me which is yeah, not, it's actually almost a no-go, because I don't like to have always a different brightness. But I can of course understand people why they yeah, preferring dynamic tone mapping over HGiG, because it gives you a better base brightness in certain situations. Okay, so let's talk about the main reason why there's not a single game out there what supports HGiG, and this counts for the Xbox and the PlayStation. When it comes to HDR gaming, we have actually two different types of games. Games like Far Cry 6, where we have all the HDR picture settings in the game options from the game. And then on the other hand, we have games like Ratchet & Clank, where we have no picture settings, no HDR picture settings in the game at all. And those games are relying on the HDR calibration menu on the consoles. But I like to make one thing very, very clear. The majority of the games, and I would almost say 95–97% of the games, they're not supporting those menus. Not at all. This is very, very rare that a game supports this calibration menu. And again, I'm just talking about the calibration menu. I'm not talking about any support from the tone mapping modus, because this is a complete different story. The only thing what games like Ratchet & Clank are doing is relying on the settings from the HDR calibration menu on the consoles, Xbox and PlayStation. This game, or the games, they don't know what tone mapping you actually use to set up those values. And it doesn't care at all, because we need also keep in mind that we have millions of TVs out there. They don't have the option HGiG. They maybe just have the option on and off, dynamic tone mapping on and off, but they also can set up this calibration menu. And of course they're using dynamic tone mapping on or dynamic tone mapping off to set this up. And then the game relies on those values. So again, this has nothing to do with HGiG or dynamic tone mapping. This game will work anyway. What is our big advantage here? HGiG will give us on our LG OLED TVs the most accurate way to display HDR content actually. If a game supports this HDR calibration menu either on the Xbox or the PlayStation 5, there is a very big chance that HGiG is the best option. But just because a game supports this, it doesn't mean that HGiG is always the best option. Okay, so just because now a game like Ratchet & Clank supports this calibration menu on the PlayStation 5 for an example, that doesn't mean we have to use HGiG. No, we don't have to, because maybe some of you like like how dynamic tone mapping is displaying HDR much better than HGiG. This is absolutely up to you. And the same counts for games like Far Cry, where we don't have any support from this HDR menu. You still can use HGiG if you like to, because with the in-game settings in the game, we are more than able to set up HGiG in a way as we like it. Again, this is absolutely up to you. There is no mandatory reason or whatever to use HGiG in a certain constellation. Not at all. It is absolutely up to you. The only thing what is to consider, of course, if a game supports this menu, you need to set it up in the correct way, either in HGiG, dynamic tone mapping off, dynamic tone mapping on, whatever mode you're using, you need to set it up in the correct way, because those games are relying on those information. And if you do it in a complete wrong way, you end up with a terrible HDR picture. Okay, time for a summary. And again, there's not a single game out there what supports HGiG, and I explained this to you because all what games like Ratchet & Clank are doing is just relying on the HDR calibration menu on your console, and that's it. This game doesn't know at all what tone mapping mode you use to set up the HDR calibration menu. If you're now asking me for a recommendation, what should you use, HGiG or dynamic tone mapping on, even in non-supported or supported games, I can't answer this because it really depends on the game. So sometimes HGiG is the better choice, sometimes dynamic tone mapping on is the better choice. And again, keep in mind, just because a game supports the HDR calibration menu on the console, it doesn't mean that you have to use HGiG. This is absolutely up to you. Okay, so I think that's enough for this video, and I hope I did not forget anything very important. I mean, I did a lot of research and a lot of notes. I think I really talked about everything what is important. Of course, you can talk about this for hours and hours, but I think we talked about the most important points. So I would say that's enough for this video. And again, if you're new to my channel, please do me the big favor, subscribe to my channel, support me. I would much appreciate it. And now I would say thank you very much for watching me. I see you guys next time. Bye.